The grand forum of the interstellar dominion was the kind of place that made a person feel small on purpose. Not accidentally small the way you feel small standing at the edge of a large natural space, where the scale is simply what it is, and was not designed with you in mind. This was different. This was small by design. Every dimension of the grand forum had been chosen by the beings who built it to communicate a specific thing to anyone who stood at its center, and that thing was this. You are one. We are many. Whatever you have come here to say exists inside something far larger than the saying of it. The ceiling disappeared into artificial clouds that had been engineered to sit at a height that made them invisible from the floor. You looked up and saw white and the suggestion of depth, and your eye told you there was more above you than you could see, and your mind received that information and adjusted accordingly. The curved tiers of seats rose from the floor in a sweep that went so high the delegates at the very top needed visual enhancement technology to see the proceedings below them. 300 civilizations. Every species in the interstellar dominion represented by at least one delegate, and most represented by several. The combined age of the civilizations in that room measured in hundreds of thousands of years, the combined memory of them stretching back to times when most of the species sitting in those seats had not yet developed the technology to know the other ones existed. The place where the fate of species was decided with a recorded vote and a closing statement. Ambassador Paul Garrett stood at the floor podium and felt every single bit of it pressing down on him. He was not an impressive figure by any standard the Dominion would have applied to the concept of impressive. Thin in the way that people who forget to eat when they are focused on something get thin. Tired around the eyes in the particular way of someone who has been waking up at odd hours for years, because their mind keeps returning to a problem that will not resolve itself just because the clock says it is time to sleep. He was wearing his best formal wear, and it had been his best formal wear for 4 years, which meant it was starting to show the specific kind of wear that best things accumulate when they're used too often because there is no budget or occasion for better. He had spent 4 years on this. Not 4 years of casual interest or part-time research. For years of the kind of work that takes over a person's life and reorganizes everything else around itself. For years of archives and translation matrices and cross-reference databases and late nights and early mornings, and the particular loneliness of being certain about something that everyone around you is equally certain is not worth being certain about. He had used every resource available to him, and several that were technically available only to departments he had leveraged old favors to access, and he had built the most careful argument of his career. He had 11 minutes to deliver it before the next agenda item was called. He delivered it. He had found references to humans across 11 ancient civilizations. He said this clearly, and he said it first because it was the foundation of everything that followed, and he wanted the delegates to have it before he added anything to it. Not one civilization. 11. Not 1 or 2 passing mentions in text that could be interpreted multiple ways. Hundreds of references, consistent in their descriptions across cultures that had existed in different regions of the galaxy during different historical periods and had no documented contact with each other. A species called humans, described across all 11 civilizations with consistency that linguistic analysts would call statistically impossible if those descriptions had been independently invented. A species that was feared. Not the mild wariness that civilizations sometimes express toward unfamiliar neighbors, but genuine deep fear recorded in texts that did not use that register of language casually. A species that was respected in terms that those civilizations reserved for things that had genuinely shaped them. Referenced not as a story or a warning or a myth, but as a reality that the beings writing about it had encountered, or knew beings who had encountered, or knew the history of encounters that had happened recently enough to still carry weight. Paul walked the chamber through the evidence methodically, the cross-references first. How a word used in one ancient civilization's records to describe human conflict behavior appeared in a completely different form in a civilization that had no linguistic connection to the first one, and yet carried the same specific meaning. How architectural records from a third civilization showed design modifications that their own historians had never been able to explain satisfactorily, but that made complete sense as defensive adaptations to a specific kind of external pressure. How trade records from a fourth civilization showed a complete and sudden cessation of activity along certain routes at a period that aligned precisely with dates mentioned in the records of 2 of the other 11 civilizations. The linguistic patterns next. showing not just that the references existed, but that the language used across all 11 sources share qualities that could not be explained by coincidence or parallel development. Qualities that appeared in language when the beings using it were describing something real and significant from direct experience, as opposed to something invented or borrowed or passed down through generations of retelling until the edges wore smooth. The mathematics last. The probability calculation. How likely was it that 11 independent civilizations with no documented contact had invented consistent descriptions of the same fictional species, with the specific details that appeared across all 11 records? The number he put on the display was not a small number. It was the kind of number that scientists use to describe things that were functionally impossible while technically remaining within the realm of theoretical possibility. High Arbiter San sat at the head of the chamber and listened with the expression of a being who had decided the conclusion before the presentation began, and was now engaged in the courtesy of appearing to receive information while actually waiting for the information to end. San was ancient, translucent skin that you could see the suggestion of structure through in certain lighting, had led the Dominion for 40 years through a period of such sustained peace and stability that the title of High Arbiter had come to feel less like a position of active leadership and more like the ceremonial acknowledgement of someone who had been right about enough things for long enough that the chamber had decided their judgment was simply correct by default. Delegate Mara Voss interrupted twice. The first interruption was a procedural objection about the classification of the source materials Paul was referencing. It was a legitimate procedural question in the narrow technical sense, and had absolutely nothing to do with the evidence being presented, and everything to do with the fact that a procedural objection on a record established doubt about methodology without requiring the objector to engage with the actual substance of what was being said. Paul answered it correctly and concisely, and continued. The second interruption questioned the translation matrices used for the cross-linguistic analysis. Again, technically legitimate. Again, entirely beside the point of what the evidence showed, and again serving the purpose of placing a question mark next to Paul's credibility in the record, without needing to address a single piece of data he had presented. Paul answered that 1, 2, and continued. The chamber received his presentation the way large bodies of people receive things they have already decided not to be changed by, with the particular quality of attention that is present enough to be called listening and distant enough to have already moved on. Some delegates looked at their secondary screens. Some spoke quietly to the colleagues beside them. A few watched with the mild interest of beings who found the presentation mildly entertaining in a way that an unusual weather pattern is entertaining. Something to observe without needing to act on. Humans were a myth. This was not a contested position in the chamber. It was settled history. Real historians had examined the references Paul was citing, and others like them generations ago, and had reached the same conclusion that real historians reached about legends that persisted across cultures without physical evidence. Stories spread, ideas moved, civilizations in proximity or in communication borrowed from each other's narrative traditions, and over time those borrowed stories accumulated the specific patina of age that made them look like independent origination when they were not. The human legend was the most persistent and the most widespread of the Dominion's collection of pre-council myths, but persistence and distribution were not evidence of reality. They were evidence of a good story. Paul reached his final point. He said the ancient references did not just describe a species. They described a location. Specifically and consistently across multiple independent sources, they described a region of space, a quarantine zone, established 10,000 years ago around coordinates that appeared in 7 of the 11 civilizations he had researched. The Dominion had maintained that quarantine zone ever since without interruption, and without ever investigating what it was originally established quarantine, or whether the original reason for quarantine still applied. He said the quarantine zone had been maintained for 10,000 years by a governing body that did not exist 10,000 years ago, based on records from civilizations that no longer existed, describing a reason that had never been verified. He said perhaps investigating what was actually in the quarantine zone was a reasonable next step regardless of any other conclusion the chamber chose to draw from his presentation. San thanked him for his contribution to the record and called the next agenda item. Paul stood at the podium for a moment after the next speaker began moving toward the floor. He watched the chamber shift its attention as smoothly and completely as a body of water shifts around a stone that has just been removed from it. the surface closing, the disturbance gone. 300 civilizations returning to the business of the day. He gathered his materials and walked aside of the chamber and stood against the wall and watched for a while. He had not mentioned the signal. He had found it 6 months ago during a routine sweep of the data coming out of the monitoring arrays at the edge of the quarantine zone. Faint and intermittent enough that the automated systems had flagged it as background noise and moved on. He had pulled the raw data and run it through analysis, and what he had found was not background noise. It was structured. It was patterned. It repeated at intervals that were too regular to be cosmic phenomena and too complex to be equipment artifacts. It was coming from the exact coordinates the ancient references pointed to. He had not mentioned it in his presentation because he had run the calculation on how mentioning it would affect his credibility, and the calculation had come back clearly. A faint, intermittent, unverified signal from an uninvestigated region of space that nobody believed contained anything of significance would not add weight to his argument. It would add a target to his argument. Something specific and checkable and easy to dismiss with a single official census sweep that would be conducted hastily by people who expected to find nothing and would therefore find nothing. So he had kept it. He stood against the wall of the Grand Forum and watched 300 civilizations discuss trade agreements and border disputes and resource allocation, and 1,000 other real and immediate concerns a galaxy that had maintained peace for 5,000 years and intended to maintain it indefinitely. And he thought about the signal. Faint, intermittent, patterned. Someone was in that quarantine zone, not as a relic or a remnant or an echo of something that had existed 10,000 years ago and left traces. As a presence, active and ongoing, and doing whatever it was doing quietly enough that 10,000 years of Dominion census sweeps had never caught more than the whisper that he had pulled from the background noise 6 months ago. He thought about what the ancient references had said about humans, feared, respected, described in language that civilizations reserved for things that had genuinely shaped them. He thought about 10,000 years. Then he picked up his materials and walked out of the Grand Forum and went back to his office and opened the signal file and looked at it for a long time in the quiet. Governor Elise Park got the call at 3 a.m. She was already half awake when it came, not because she had been expecting it specifically, but because she had spent 11 years running an outer colony, and 11 years of outer colony administration had trained her body to sleep lightly. The outer systems were not dangerous in the way that dangerous places were obviously dangerous. They were dangerous in the quiet background way of places that existed far from the center of things, where response times were long and resources were limited, and the comfortable assumption that someone else would handle emergencies if they arose was not an assumption that the reality of the outer system supported. She had learned to sleep like someone who might need to be fully functional on short notice. Her communicator activated, and she was sitting up before the second pulse finished. She read the identifier, Brent Okafor. She was out of bed before she finished reading it. Not because Brent called often at odd hours. He did not. Brent was the kind of person who handled things at the level they needed to be handled at and escalated only when escalation was genuinely required, and he had good judgment about where that line was. In 11 years of working alongside him, Elise could count on one hand the times he had contacted her outside of normal working hours. Each of those times had been worth the interruption. She answered and told him she was awake, and he told her to come to the operations center. She ran Varen's rest the way she ran everything, with the practical no-drama competence of someone who had chosen a difficult job and decided that choosing it meant doing it completely. 40,000 people, agricultural colony, mid-sized by outer system standards. The kind of place that existed in the comfortable assumption that nothing catastrophic happened to places like it, because nothing catastrophic had happened to places like it in 11 years she had been there and the generations before that. She had built her administration on competence, and she had built her team on the same standard, and Brent Okafor was the best example of what that standard produced. Former military from a period when the Dominion military had still meant something. He had left active service not out of any failure on his part, but because the Dominion military had been progressively reduced over 5 centuries of unbroken peace to something that looked like a military from the outside and functioned like a ceremonial organization from the inside. Brent had no interest in ceremonial organizations. He had come to Varen's Rest because the outer colonies still maintained something resembling actual defense infrastructure, even if that infrastructure was modest, and the people running it were not going to be confused with a real military force by anyone who had seen one. He was the most competent person she had on staff for the thing that was about to matter most. When she walked into the operations center, he was standing at the main display with his back to the door, and he did not turn around when she came in. He was looking at the sensor data the way he looked at things when the looking was doing work. She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. She read it carefully. She was not a military person, and she had never claimed to be, but she had spent 11 years learning enough to understand what her defense coordinator was telling her when he brought her information, and what she was looking at now she understood without needing it translated. 3 Vrail vessels, at the edge of the system, not in transit, not conducting the kind of broad passive scan that vessels sometimes ran when passing through a region they had not mapped recently. The configuration was specific, and Brent had annotated the display with the reference data, so she could see exactly what specific configuration it was. She read the annotation. Pre-harvest confirmation formation. The Vrail ran this configuration when they had identified a target and were conducting final verification before committing a harvest fleet. It was not a patrol. It was not a warning. It was the last step before the decision was made, and the decision once made was not reversed. Elise had read about the Vrail in the context of outer system security briefings that crossed her desk periodically. Dried documents produced by Dominion analysts who wrote about threats in the careful language of people who had never seen the things they were analyzing and who existed in an institutional environment that discouraged the kind of direct, alarming language that might suggest a 5,000 years of Dominion peace, had left genuine gaps in the galaxy's ability to handle something that peace could not address. She had read those documents and noted them and moved on to the next item because the outer systems had immediate problems that required immediate attention, and the Vrail were a distant concern that the Dominion would presumably handle through the same dialogue and diplomatic pressure that the Dominion used to handle everything. She understood now in a way she had not understood from those documents what the Vrail actually were. They did not conquer. Conquest implied a desire for territory, a wish to control and administer and extract ongoing value from a place and the people in it. The Vrail had no interest in any of that. They moved through systems and took what they wanted away a natural disaster, moved through a region, not with malice, not with any particular feeling at all, with the simple operational efficiency of a process that had been refined over a very long time to extract maximum value from each location visited, everything of value, including the population, and then they moved on. Elise sent the emergency request to the Dominion within the hour. She wrote it herself rather than delegating it because she wanted the language to be precise, and she wanted the urgency to be unmistakable, and she had learned over 11 years that the way something was written affected how it was received even in situations where the content should have made the presentation irrelevant. She made it clear. 3 Vrail vessels in pre-harvest formation, 40,000 civilians, 4-day window before arrival of harvest fleet if standard Vrail operational timelines held. Request for immediate military response. The Dominion responded in 4 hours. She read the response twice because the first reading produced a result she was not willing to accept without verification. The response was long. It was thorough. It used careful language and expressed genuine concern and outlined the Dominion's position on external predatory species with the kind of institutional thoroughness that documents produced by large bureaucracies acquire when they are written by people who understand that the document will be reviewed by multiple departments before it is sent, and that each department will want to see its own concerns reflected in the final language. No military assets were positioned in the outer colonies. The Dominion's unified peace force was configured for peacekeeping operations between member civilizations. It was not designed or equipped for rapid response to external predatory species in the outer systems. The nearest assets capable of mounting a meaningful response were 17 days from Varen's Rest at standard transit speed. She put the response down and looked at Brent. He had already done the calculation. She could see it in his face. Not panic. Brent did not panic. Something quieter and more honest than panic. The expression of a person who has done the math correctly and is now deciding how to carry the result. She asked him to show her what they had. 6 patrol ships, She knew this already, but she let him walk her through it, because walking through it was part of how she processed things, and Brent understood that. 6 vessels designed for search and rescue operations and light law enforcement duties in the outer systems. Capable crews, people she knew by name, people who showed up every day and did their jobs and had built their careers in service that had never required them to fire a weapon at another vessel, because that was not what the service was for. Brent walked her through the weapons loadout on the patrol ships and the weapons loadout on a standard rail harvest vessel, and he did not finish the comparison, because he did not need to. She could see where the comparison ended before he got there. He did not say the result of the math out loud. She did not ask him to. Elise sat at the operations center console and looked at the display for a long moment. 40,000 people, the families who had been on this colony for 3 generations, the children who had been born here, the people who had built the farms and the processing facilities and the small town centers and the community spaces that made Varen's Rest a specific place. It was rather than just a dot on a sector map. She thought about 17 days and 4 days, and the gap between those 2 numbers that could not be closed by anything the Dominion had available to close it. Then she thought about Paul Garrett. She had followed his work for 2 years, not because the Dominion took it seriously, but because Paul was the only person in the Dominion's entire political structure who had been consistently treating external threats as real things that required real attention rather than distant theoretical concerns that the machinery of peace would eventually address through dialogue and diplomatic pressure. She had read his papers, and she had read his presentation requests, and she had read the responses those requests received, and she had thought on more than one occasion that Paul Garrett was a man who was going to be right about something important at exactly the moment when being right would be least helpful, because the time to act on what he was right about would already have passed. She contacted him directly and sent the censored data. He called her back in 20 minutes. He sounded alert for someone she had reached in what was the middle of his night cycle. He asked one question about the sensor configuration, and she told him what Brent had confirmed, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he told her there was something he had never shared with the Dominion. He told her about the signal, faint, intermittent, coming from the quarantine zone for 6 months. And then he told her about the file, an ancient document from the oldest fragment in his collection. A description of a beacon, a specific transmission system buried in the Dominion's oldest communication infrastructure, placed there 10,000 years ago by the beings who established the quarantine zone, designed to send a specific compressed signal to the exact coordinates in the quarantine zone where the ancient references pointed. The document described what the beacon was for. It was not for routine communication. It was not for diplomatic contact or exploratory outreach. The language around it was careful and specific, and had been written by beings who wanted to be very clear about when the beacon should and should not be used. It should only be used when there was no other option. Paul did not tell her what he expected would happen if he activated it. She did not ask him, because the honest answer was that neither of them knew, and knowing would not have changed the calculation anyway. She looked at the sensor display. She looked at the number 4. She looked at the number 17. She looked at the names of the 40,000 people on her colony that she had in a file she never opened because the list was too long to hold in your head, and she had learned that the way you carried responsibility for that many people was to think of them as individuals, not as a number, even when the situation was presenting them to you as a number. She told Paul to use it. Paul opened the file he'd been carrying for 6 months, and his hands did not shake when he accessed the beacon controls, because he was not that kind of person, and also because shaking was not going to help 40,000 people who had 4 days. He activated the beacon. The transmission lasted 3 seconds. A compressed burst of quantum-entangled data fired toward coordinates in the quarantine zone that had been waiting to receive exactly that signal for 10,000 years. Then the system went dormant, and the room was quiet, and Paul and Elise were both on the same channel in the silence of what they had just done. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Elise said she was going back to the operations center. She had 4 days to prepare everything she could prepare, and she intended to use all 4 of them. She closed the channel and went back to work. Admiral Frank Reeves was on the bridge of his flagship 4 minutes after the beacon activated. 4 minutes was how long it took him to get from his quarters to the bridge at the pace he moved when the alert came through. He had timed it once early in his command tenure, the way he had timed every variable that mattered to operational readiness, and 4 minutes was a number he had arrived at, and 4 minutes was what he had just demonstrated. It still was 9 years later. He was not young anymore, and he had never been particularly fast, but he was consistent, and in his experience, consistency was more reliable than speed, when speed was not always available and consistency was. He was in his 50s. Broad across the shoulders in a way of someone who had spent decades in environments where physical capability was part of professional responsibility and had maintained that standard past the age when maintaining it required actual effort rather than simply not abandoning habits already formed. His face had the quality that faces acquired after enough years of making decisions that had real consequences for real people. Not hard exactly, not closed, just marked, the way it was marked by weather. Still functional, still the thing it had always been, just carrying the evidence of everything it had been through. He had commanded the Terran Strategic Fleet for 9 years. In those 9 years, the fleet had trained continuously and maintained readiness continuously and run simulations and drills and scenario exercises that covered every contingency the Terran Strategic Planning Division could construct. They had done all of this with the professional dedication of people who took their mandate seriously and with a particular undercurrent of uncertainty that ran beneath everything they did because the mandate was built on a promise made 10,000 years ago, and the promise might never be called on. And if it was never called on, then everything they had built and maintained and trained for existed in a permanent state of potential that might simply remain potential forever. The beacon had been the fixed point around which all of it orbited. The theoretical event that justified everything. The thing that was always possible and therefore always prepared for, and that had remained, through 9 years of Frank's command and the decades of command that preceded his stubbornly theoretical. He settled into his command chair, and Commander Nina Walsh was already turning toward him from her station. Nina was younger than Frank by about 15 years and operated at a speed of information processing that Frank had stopped trying to match and started simply relying on. She had the signal analysis ready. She had prepared it in the time between the beacon activation alert and his arrival on the bridge, which meant she had prepared in under 4 minutes, while also presumably managing the initial alert protocols and the preliminary status checks that were standard procedure when something activated that had not activated in living memory. She handed him the analysis without being asked, and he read it while she talked him through the key points simultaneously, because that was how they worked, and it was efficient. The beacon was genuine, not a malfunction, not a sensor artifact, not a test activation from some automated system running a maintenance cycle that had gone undetected. The signal carried the full authentication sequence that the ancient treaty parameters specified. Every element of the beacon transmission matched the specifications in the Terran Strategic Archives, exactly as they had been recorded and maintained and updated through every command rotation for 10,000 years. Someone on the other side of the quarantine zone had accessed the beacon controls. Someone who knew the beacon existed and knew where it was and knew the authentication sequence required to activate it. And that someone had activated it, which under the terms of the ancient treaty meant one thing and one thing only. The conditions were met. Frank looked up from the analysis and looked around at his crew. The bridge of the flagship was fully staffed, every station occupied. The alert had brought everyone to their posts with the speed of people who had drilled a response to the specific alert enough times that the response was reflex. He looked at each station the sweep that his eyes made automatically, and what he saw was what he'd seen on his crew's faces in drills and exercises and simulations for 9 years, except different in a way that drills and exercises and simulations could not produce. Every face on his bridge was a face of someone who had just understood that the theoretical thing was not theoretical anymore. They had all been here long enough to have spent years quietly assuming in the back of their minds that the beacon would never actually activate, not because they doubted the mandate or the mission or the validity of what they were doing. Because 10,000 years was a very long time, and things that had not happened in 10,000 years developed a kind of gravity that made not happening feel like the expected state. They had prepared. They had maintained readiness. They had shown up every day and done the work. And somewhere in each of them behind professionalism and the training, there had been a part that had made a private peace with the possibility that the work might never be called on. That part was being revised now in real time on every face he looked at. He gave the order to spin up the fleet. The order moved through the chain of command with the efficiency of a system that had been built specifically to execute it quickly. Across 12 vessels, the activation sequences began. Engines coming from standby to operational. Weapon systems running through their initialization cycles. Navigation calculating the transit vectors that the beacon coordinates specified. Communication arrays confirming inter-fleet connectivity and encrypting channels for operational security. The quarantine zone had been silent for 10,000 years. 2 hours after Frank gave the order to spin up the fleet, the Dominion sensor arrays at the edge of the exclusion zone began registering something they had no protocol for. The arrays had been positioned there for exactly the purpose their name described. They monitored the exclusion zone and reported what they found, which for 10,000 years had been nothing, and which was now suddenly and dramatically not nothing. The power readings coming from inside the quarantine zone were unlike anything the arrays had been calibrated to expect. Something large was activating. Multiple large things. The energy signatures were consistent with propulsion systems and weapon systems and the full operational startup of vessels that had been in standby configuration for a very long time. The arrays sent automated alerts through the Dominion communication network, and the alerts triggered responses from monitoring stations, and the monitoring stations escalated to regional command, and regional command escalated upward, and within a short time the Dominion's political leadership was receiving urgent queries about what was happening in the space that had been quiet for as long as anyone had records. The communications that reached Frank's fleet through the channels his intelligence section monitored were exactly what he would have predicted: confusion, alarm, the specific kind of institutional panic that large bureaucracies experience when something happened outside the parameters their procedures had been designed to address. Council members who had sat in the Grand Forum and dismissed Paul Garrett's presentation with polite boredom were now sending urgent requests for information to departments that had no information to give them because the departments had been monitoring empty space and were now monitoring something that was not empty and had not yet developed a framework for what to do about that. Frank called his captains. The briefing was direct and short because direct and short was how Frank ran briefings when the operational situation was time-sensitive, and this one was as time-sensitive as any he had ever run. The treaty was clear. Earth had received a distress signal from inside Dominion space. Earth would respond to that signal. The mandate that had existed for 10,000 years was now active, and the fleet would move to the coordinates specified in the beacon signal and address the threat those coordinates indicated. One of his captains asked what they should expect from the Dominion when they arrived. Frank considered the question for a moment. It was a reasonable question. The Dominion was the political entity whose space they would be entering. The relationship between Earth and the Dominion was 10,000 years old and had been maintained entirely from Earth's side without any Dominion awareness of its existence. The Dominion believed humans were a legend. The Dominion's entire political and cultural framework had been built over 5,000 years on the foundation of a peace that had no place in it for what Frank's fleet represented. He said he did not know what to expect from the Dominion. He said the Dominion's last official position on humans was that humans did not exist. He said some members of the Dominion's leadership might still hold that position when 12 human warships came out of faster-than-light travel in their territorial space, and that they would need to be prepared for a range of responses from the Dominion that could include anything from immediate cooperation to something considerably less straightforward. He said the mission was the mission regardless of the Dominion's response. The beacon had been activated. People needed help. Earth was responding. The captains acknowledged and returned to their ships. Nina had the Vrail intelligence file ready on his secondary display before he asked for it. He read it carefully. The Terran intelligence archives on the Vrail were considerably more comprehensive than anything the Dominion possessed on the same subject, and Frank had always known this in the abstract way of knowing something that had never been operationally relevant. It was relevant now, and reading the file with operational relevance in mind was a different experience than reading it as background knowledge. The Vrail were efficient. That was the word that the Terran analysts who had compiled the file kept returning to across decades of observation and documentation. Not cruel in any way that implied feeling. Not aggressive in any way that implied emotion. Efficient. They had developed a harvesting methodology over centuries of operation that extracted maximum value from each target system with minimum expenditure of resources and time. They moved in a sequence. Scout, confirm, commit, extract, move on. The sequence had worked for them consistently across a significant number of operations that the Terran archives had documented. Frank read the section on Vrel response to military resistance carefully. The Vrel had encountered resistance before. They had encountered resistance from Dominion-adjacent civilizations that had attempted to defend themselves with what they had available. The file documented those encounters in detail. The Vrel adapted to resistance efficiently, the same way they did everything efficiently. They applied additional force in the specific amounts required to overcome the specific resistance presented. They had never encountered resistance from something that had prepared specifically for them. Frank closed the file and looked at his weapons officer. He said, "Get everything ready," and he said it in the tone that meant not the standard readiness level, but the level above that, the level that was there for situations where standard was not going to be the right tool. His weapons officer acknowledged and turned back to his station, and Frank could see from the quality of attention the man brought to his console that he understood exactly what get everything ready meant in this context. 12 Terran warships moved toward the edge of the quarantine zone. The speed they were traveling had not moved through that region of space in 10,000 years, and the sensor arrays at the exclusion boundary registered it as something their calibration had not anticipated, which was an accurate description of most of what was happening in that region of space at that moment. Frank stood at the navigation display and looked at the star map. Varen's rest was marked. The Vrel approach vectors were projected from the scout vessel positions that the beacon signal data had included. The 4-day window was there as a timeline. The Dominion response asset position was there with its 17-day transit time marked clearly. He did the calculation that the map was presenting him with and arrived at the result that anyone who looked at those numbers arrived at. He looked at Nina. He said, "How long to Varen's rest at best speed?" She told him. He looked at the star map for a moment longer. At the 4 days and the 17 days and the 40,000 people that the beacon signal had been sent to protect, he said, "Push it harder." Nina turned to navigation station and relayed the order, and the fleet's engines adjusted and the speed increased, and the quarantine zone fell way behind 12 warships moving through space toward a system where 40,000 people had 4 days, and the only thing between them and something that did not negotiate was now on its way. The Vrel arrived 36 hours early. Elise had run the timeline in her head so many times over the previous 4 days that the numbers had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like physical objects she was carrying. For days, 17 days, the gap between them, she had organized everything she could organize around those numbers. The evacuation protocols that could not actually evacuate 40,000 people in 4 days, but could move the most vulnerable populations to the most defensible locations. The patrol ship deployment strategy that Brent had built with the careful precision of someone constructing the best possible answer to a question that did not have a good answer. The communication channels kept open to the Dominion response force that was 17 days away and getting closer at a rate that the math refused to make sufficient. She had been in the command center for most of the past 96 hours. Not continuously. She had gone to her quarters twice for short periods because Brent had told her that a governor who collapsed from exhaustion was less useful than a governor who slept 4 hours, and she had recognized the truth of that and acted on it. But she had slept the way she slept in the outer systems. Lightly, with one part of her mind still connected to the situation, even in the hours when the rest of her was trying to rest. The alert came at a time she had not been expecting it, and she had been expecting it at any moment for 4 days, which meant the alert arriving was simultaneously surprise, and not a surprise, and her body processed it as both at once, 36 hours early. She read the sensor confirmation twice. The Vrel fleet had not followed the standard operational timeline that Terran intelligence had documented and Brent had used to build his calculations. They had accelerated their approach. Whether because they had detected the patrol ship deployment and decided to reduce the preparation time available, or because their internal operational schedule had simply moved faster than projected, she did not know, and it did not matter. What mattered was the number on the screen. 14 days. That was how far away the Dominion response force was now. 14 days reduced from 17 by the time that had passed and the distance covered. Still 14 days. She looked at Brent. He was already looking at her. His face had the quality it had carried since the first morning. Not panic, something more controlled than panic, and in some ways harder to look at. The face of a person who had done the work correctly and arrived at a conclusion that the work could not change. The 6 patrol ships were already moving into formation. She watched it on the display. The patrol fleet commander had received the same sensor alert at the same moment she had, and had executed the deployment plan without waiting for her confirmation, because the deployment plan had been built for exactly this moment, and waiting for confirmation would have spent time that the moment did not have. She watched 6 small vessels arrange themselves between the Vril fleet and the colony with the deliberate precision of crews who had drilled a formation until the drilling was done, and now were doing the real thing. They were not military vessels. She knew this with precision that the display reinforced every time she looked at the comparative readouts. Search and rescue configuration. Light weapons designed for the specific scenarios that outer colony patrol work produced. Good sensors. Good communications. Crews who were professional and capable and had shown up every day for years and done their jobs well. They were in a formation that placed them between the Vril fleet and 40,000 people, and every person on every one of those 6 ships understood what the sensor readings said about the difference between what they were and what was coming toward them. They held the formation anyway. Elise watched them hold it and felt something move through her that she did not have a clean word for. Not hope, exactly. Not relief. Something that had to do with what it meant that people could know exactly what a situation was and choose to be in it anyway, because the situation required someone to be in it. The Vril transmission came 12 minutes after their fleet entered effective communication range. It was not a message in any sense that implied communication was the purpose of it. It was a declaration, a formal operational notification of the type that Vril harvest fleets transmitted as a standard procedural step. We are here. We have identified the system as a harvest target. This is what will occur. The transmission carried no question, no opening, no space in its structure for response, because response was not something the Vril transmission protocol included. It was a notification of a process beginning, the kind of communication you sent not to inform but to document. The patrol fleet commander opened a channel to the Vril frequency immediately after the transmission completed. His name was Carl Webb. Elise knew him, had worked alongside him for 3 years. He was a careful man, methodical. He had read the Vril documentation she had shared with the patrol crews, and he knew what the documentation said about Vril response to communication attempts. He opened the channel anyway because Dominion procedure called for communication attempts at every stage of an escalating situation, and because he was a Dominion officer and Dominion procedure was the framework he had been trained in and trained to maintain, and he was going to maintain it completely until the situation made maintaining it impossible. He spoke in a measured professional tone of someone delivering a communication that represented his best effort at a very difficult task. He identified himself and his vessel and his affiliation. He expressed that the system was inhabited by civilian population. He indicated a desire to discuss alternatives to the declared operation. He used careful language, respectful language, the kind of language that the Dominion had used to resolve conflicts between member civilizations for 5,000 years with consistent success. The Vril did not respond. Not a refusal. Not a counter-transmission. Not any acknowledgement that the channel had been received or that communication had been attempted. Simply nothing. The frequency remained open and Carl Webb's transmission went into it, and the Vril continued their approach on the same vector, at the same speed with no observable change in their operational status. Carl tried again. He modified the language. He offered resource alternatives. He referenced the civilian population figures. He identified specific elements of Vril documented interests that the colony might be able to address through negotiated arrangement. He was doing everything that Dominion training and Dominion procedure had given him to do, and he was doing it competently and thoroughly, and the Vril did not respond to any of it. The patrol ships held their formation. Elise watched the display and watched the distance between the Vril fleet and the patrol line, closing at the steady rate of an approach that had not changed its vector since the moment the Vril entered the system. She thought about 6 ships and what 6 ships were and what was coming toward them, and she thought about 36 hours early in 14 days and the gap that those numbers described. She was thinking about that gap when the frequency opened, not the Vril frequency. A different one, An open frequency that covered the entire system simultaneously. A voice that was calm and clear and entirely unlike anything anyone in the Varen's rest system had been expecting to hear, because it identified itself with words that had not been spoken in any Dominion system in 10,000 years. A woman's voice. Steady, professional, no urgency in it, and no performance of calm. Just actual calm. The calm of someone who was exactly where they had come to be and was doing the specific thing they had come to do. She identified her vessel as the UES Relentless. She requested that the patrol fleet hold its current position and stand by. She said stand by in the tone of someone who meant the word specifically and expected them to be acted on immediately. The patrol fleet commander did not respond verbally. Elise watched his formation on her display and saw it hold. Carl Webb had received the transmission and made a decision in whatever time it took him to decide, and the decision was to hold position and stand by. Every sensor array in the Varen's rest system activated simultaneously, not gradually, not one station detecting something, and then another, all of them at once registering a change in the space between the Vrail fleet and the colony. Elise looked at her display and saw the readings and looked at Brent, and Brent was already looking at the display with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not his professional face. Not the face of someone carrying a conclusion that the work could not change. Something different. 12 contacts. Appearing in the space between the Vrail fleet and the colony with the specific signature of vessels that had just completed a faster-than-light transit. Not decelerating from a distant approach. Not emerging from behind cover. Transitioning directly into position with a precision that placed them exactly where they needed to be with no wasted movement and no adjustment required. Not behind the patrol ships. In front of them. Between the Vrail fleet and the colony. Closer to the Vrail than the patrol ships were. Positioned in the specific space that was between the threat and the people in a way that made the positioning itself a statement before a single word had been said. 12 warships. Not patrol class. Not the ceremonial defense vessels that the Dominion maintained for appearances. Something built for a purpose that Dominion ships had stopped being built for 5 centuries ago. The sensor readings on Elise's display described weapon systems and structural configurations and power outputs that did not match anything in the Dominion's catalog of known vessel types because they were not in that catalog. They had never been in that catalog. Frank Reeves opened a channel on every frequency the system carried simultaneously. Every ship in the system received it. Every surface installation on the colony received it. Elise received it standing in her command center with Brent beside her and a display showing 12 contacts in front of the patrol line. His voice was not the voice of someone making an offer or extending a courtesy. It was the voice of someone stating a condition. The voice of someone who had assessed the situation and was communicating its parameters to the relevant parties with the direct efficiency of someone who did not have time or inclination for anything other than direct efficiency. You are in a protected system. 5 words. Plain and unambiguous, and carrying in their plainness the entire weight of what was behind them. Not a warning delivered in the careful diplomatic language of someone hoping the warning would be sufficient and dreading what came next if it was not. A statement of fact. This system is protected. That is the condition. Here is what the condition means. You will withdraw, or we will remove you. Not we will attempt to prevent your operation. Not we will take defensive measures. We will remove you. The distinction was not small, and Elise understood it, and she suspected everyone in the system understood it, including the Vrail, who had never been told something like that before, and were now being told it in a voice that did not waver. You have 60 seconds to begin withdrawal. Elise stopped breathing. She had not decided to stop breathing. Her body made the decision independently, the way bodies sometimes made decisions when the moment they were inside was too large for normal automatic functions to continue running in the background without interruption. Brent stood beside her and did not speak. He was watching the display with the same quality of attention that he had brought to everything since the first morning. Complete, focused, the attention of someone who understood what they were watching and was watching it completely. The Vrail did not respond. The 60 seconds began. Elise watched the timer she put on her display without consciously deciding to. She watched the Vrail fleet on the sensors. Their formation had not changed. Their approach vector had not changed. Their operational status showed no modification in response to the transmission they had received. They continued their approach with the same steady efficiency they had shown since entering the system. The same efficiency that had never needed a change before, because nothing they had encountered before had given them a reason to change it. The timer moved through its count. Nobody in the command center spoke. Nobody on the patrol ship spoke. The open frequencies that covered the system carried nothing but the background noise of space and the steady soft sound of equipment running. And somewhere in the system, 12 vessels that had not existed in this part of the galaxy for 10,000 years held their position between the Vrail fleet and 40,000 people and waited. The 60 seconds ended. Frank looked at Nina. He said, "Begin." The battle was not long. That was the part that people found hardest to reconcile afterward when they tried to describe what they had witnessed on their sensor displays and their monitoring feeds and the raw unfiltered data that every recording system in the Varan's rest system had captured from the moment Frank Reeves said begin. They expected something that matched the scale of what was deciding, a conflict that would determine whether 40,000 people lived or died. A confrontation between a fleet that had consumed billions across 27 worlds and something that had just announced its presence in this part of the galaxy for the first time in 10,000 years. Something that large should have taken a long time, should have ground on through hours of exchange and adjustment and the slow accumulation of advantage that major engagements were supposed to produce. It did not take a long time, not because the Vrail were not capable. They were capable. Everything in the Terran intelligence archives documented their capability, with the careful precision of observers who had been watching them operate for long enough to understand exactly what they were and what they could do. Their vessels were built for the specific function they served, and they served that function with an efficiency that had never failed them across a significant documented history of operations. They were not a small threat that had been made to look large by the inadequacy of everything the Dominion had available to respond to it. They were a large threat that had earned its record through actual operational performance. The record ended here. The Terran warships moved in the opening seconds with a coordination that went beyond the standard meaning of the word. Coordination usually described multiple units working toward the same goal with enough communication between them to keep their efforts aligned. What the 12 ships demonstrated in those opening seconds was something past that. Something that had the quality of a single organism moving through a space that it had mapped in advance with enough precision that each part of it knew exactly where every other part was and what every other part was doing, and what the combined effect of all of it moving simultaneously in specific directions at specific speeds would produce. Not wild, not the urgent improvised response of something reacting to a threat as it developed. Deliberate in the specific sense of the word, that meant each action had been thought about before the moment required it. The thinking had happened over years. The preparation had happened over years. The files that Nina Walsh had pulled from the Terran intelligence archives on the Vrail represented years of observation and analysis that had been conducted specifically so that when this moment arrived the people, and it would not be encountering the Vrail for the first time. They had been encountering the Vrail for years. In archives and simulations and strategic planning sessions, they had built answers to every question the Vrail's operational methods produced. And when the moment came, those answers were ready. The Vrail had never encountered anything that had specifically prepared for them. Everything they had ever faced had been improvised. Civilizations responding to a threat they had not predicted with resources not designed for the purpose of meeting it. The Vrail's efficiency was built in part on that consistency, on the reliable fact that everything they encountered was working from a disadvantage that began before the first exchange and was never fully recovered from. That disadvantage was not present now, and the Vrail had no framework for its absence. Elise Park watched it on her display from the command center and could not look away. She had spent 4 days preparing for the worst outcome she could construct from the numbers available to her, and what she was watching now was not that outcome. She understood what she was seeing in general terms. 12 ships moving through the space between the Vrail fleet and the colony with a purpose and efficiency that produced results on the sensor display with a speed that her mind kept needing to verify against a timestamp, because the timestamp said the results were happening faster than she had believed results of this kind could happen. Brent stood beside her and watched without speaking. He had more specific knowledge than she did about what the display was showing him. He had the military background that gave him a framework for reading engagement data in real time. She watched his face as much as she watched the display, because his face was translating the data into something she could read more directly than the numbers. What she saw on his face was not relief. Not yet. It was something more careful than relief. The face of someone who had been carrying a conclusion for 4 days that the work could not change, and was now watching conclusion change, and was not yet willing to trust a change completely, because trusting it too early and being wrong would cost something he was not prepared to spend. The Vrail adapted. She could see that on the display too. They were not static. They adjusted their formation. They redistributed their response. They did the things that a capable, organized force did when the engagement was not proceeding as their operational models predicted. Frank had accounted for the adaptation. The intelligence archives had documented Vrail adaptation patterns with enough consistency that the patterns were predictable, and predictable patterns could be answered in advance the same way every other part of Vrail operational method had been answered in advance. Every time the Vrail adjusted, the adjustment had already been anticipated. The engagement moved towards conclusion with the steady, purposeful momentum of something following a plan rather than reacting to events. The Terran fleet was not destroying the Vrail ships. Elise noticed this at some point in the middle of the engagement, and it stayed with her. The targeting was specific. The strikes were placed with precision that spoke to a decision about what was being hit and what was not being hit. Propulsion systems, weapons arrays, the specific systems that made a vessel an operational threat rather than a vessel, not life support, not crew areas, not the parts of the ships that contained the people operating them. Frank Reeves had made a decision before the engagement began about what outcome he was building toward, and the outcome was not the destruction of the Vrail fleet. It was the removal of the Vrail fleet from the system and the delivery of a message to every Vrail operational decision-maker who would receive the report of what happened here. The message was not about what Earth could destroy. It was about what Earth was. That there was something in this galaxy now that the Vrail would need to account for in every calculation they made about where to go and what to do when they got there. Destruction would have sent a message about power. What Frank chose sent a message about something more durable than power. When the engagement ended, the Vrail fleet was withdrawing, damaged, capable of transit, but not of continuing the operation. Moving away from Varen's rest on a vector that pointed away from the colony and away from the Terran fleet with a particular quality of movement that distinguished a strategic withdrawal from a route. Controlled, deliberate, faster than their approach had been. Elise let herself breathe. She stood in the command center and breathed and looked at the display showing the Vrail fleet moving away and the 12 Terran warships holding their position between where the Vrail had been and where the colony was. She looked at the 6 patrol ships still in their formation, still intact. Carl Webb and his crews who had held their position, knowing what holding it likely meant, and had held it anyway. She did not have words for what she felt looking at those 6 vessels. She did not try to find them. Some things deserve to exist without being immediately converted into language. Frank opened a channel to Paul Garrett 20 minutes after the engagement ended. Paul was in his office in the Dominion's administrative district. He had been monitoring every available feed since he activated the beacon, and he had watched what he could watch from the data available to him, and had spent the past hours in the specific state of a person waiting for information that would determine whether a decision they made was the right one. The channel opening was the information. Frank's voice came through, and Paul listened to everything he said. He told Paul that Earth had kept its promise, that the quarantine zone had not been empty for 10,000 years, that humanity had been there the entire time, watching, maintaining readiness, maintaining the treaty that the Dominion had forgotten was real. And they were here now because the beacon had been activated, and the beacon meant the conditions were met, and when the conditions were met, Earth responded. Paul sat in his office and held the weight of that for a moment. Then he asked a question that had been underneath everything since the first ancient reference he had found 4 years ago. He asked why humanity had stayed hidden for so long. 10,000 years. The entire history of the Dominion. Every crisis and every conflict and every moment when the galaxy had needed something that the Dominion's peace had not been able to provide. Why hidden for all of that? Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said because 10,000 years ago the galaxy was not ready for humans. He said it without apology and without elaboration, as if it was simply the accurate description of a historical condition. Then he said he was not entirely sure the galaxy was ready now, but the promise had been made, and promises were kept. Those were the words he used. Not we honor our commitments or we fulfill our obligations. Promises are kept, simple and direct and carrying, in its simplicity, the full weight of 10,000 years. Paul took it to the Grand Forum. He had not planned to go back so quickly. He had walked out of that chamber 11 minutes into his presentation. 4 years of work dismissed with the polite efficiency of a body that had already decided conclusion. He had carried that dismissal for 4 years as a specific kind of weight that people carry when they were right about something, and being right was not enough. He walked back and now with footage. The chamber was different before he said a word. The footage of 12 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel between a Vrail fleet and a colony had moved through the Dominion's information networks with the speed of something that nobody was trying to manage because nobody had the framework yet to manage it. Every species in the Dominion had seen it. Every delegate in the Grand Forum had seen it on whatever screen they had been looking at when the system feeds carried it. Nobody had been able to explain it in any framework the Dominion's 5,000 years of peace had given them for explaining things. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was filing procedural objections. Nobody was speaking to their neighbor with the comfortable disengagement of someone who had already decided the conclusion. 300 civilizations were quiet in the way that only genuine surprise could produce, not the trained attentive quiet of people performing the appearance of listening. The genuine quiet of people who had encountered something that exceeded their existing categories and were in the process of building new ones. High Arbiter San asked one question. The ancient being who had led the Dominion for 40 years and had been right about everything that mattered for long enough that the chamber had decided their judgment was correct by default asked Paul Garrett one question in a voice that carried something Paul had never heard in it before. It asked if the humans were a threat to the Dominion. Paul stood at the floor podium and thought about 60 seconds on an open channel. He thought about a choice to disable rather than destroy made by someone who could have made a different choice and understood the difference between what the two choices communicated. He thought about 10,000 years of watching without acting, of maintaining a readiness that had never been called on until it was needed, of a species that had positioned itself in a quarantine zone and stayed there and watched and waited not because the galaxy did not need them, but because a decision about when to be present was made by criteria that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with something harder to define. He thought about 12 ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in front of the patrol line, not behind it, not at a safe distance from which to assess the situation and determine the optimal response. In front, between. He said they had been watching us for 10,000 years, and the first thing they did when they came was stand between 40,000 civilians and something that wanted to kill them. He paused and looked at the chamber. He said you can decide for yourself what that makes them. The Grand Forum was the quietest Paul had ever heard it, not the quiet of a chamber between agenda items, not the quiet of procedural transition. The deep, genuine quiet of 10,000 years of combined civilization, encountering something that required all of its history to begin to understand, and understanding it was going to take longer than the moment allowed. The main display showed the footage. It played, and then it played again. 12 ships, coming out of faster-than-light travel in the space between the Vrail fleet and the colony, not behind the defense line, in front of it, in the position that put them closest to the threat, and between the threat and the people. Paul watched it with 300 civilizations and thought about 4 years of being told the humans were a legend. He thought about the signal he had found in the background noise of the quarantine zone monitoring arrays. He thought about the beacon he had never mentioned in his presentation, because mentioning it would have made things worse rather than better. He thought about a lease park at 3 a.m, and a 4-day window, and a decision made without hesitation, because the alternative to the decision was not acceptable. He thought about Frank Reeves saying promises are kept. The galaxy was going to need time. That was honest, and Paul was an honest person. Time to understand what had arrived. Time to process what 10,000 years of hidden presence meant, and what the intentions behind it were, and what the relationship between Earth and the Dominion would look like now that the relationship was no longer entirely theoretical. The conversations would be long. The questions would be many. Some of them would be difficult questions about power and trust, and what it meant that a species had watched from a distance for 10,000 years and chosen the specific moment it chose to make itself known. Those conversations were coming, but they had not started yet, and in the moment before they started, Paul Garrett stood in the grand forum of the Interstellar Dominion and looked at the footage on the main display and thought that whatever those conversations produced, whatever the galaxy eventually made or what had arrived, whatever relationship was built or not built in the years ahead, at least it had started from the right place, not from a demonstration of power, not from a declaration of intent, not from any of the things that a species emerging from 10,000 years of hidden readiness could have chosen to make its first statement, from standing between the people who needed protecting and the thing that was coming for them. That was where it started. And for the first time in 4 years, Paul Garrett stood in the grand forum of the Interstellar Dominion and did not feel the weight of being right about something that nobody believed. He felt something else, something that took him a moment to identify, because it had been a long time since he had felt it in that room. Hope.